Good morning, everyone. And we are finishing the week today with Alex Quigley. And I know a lot of people have been anticipating this particular session. Alex is going to be talking to us about closing the reading gap, something that he knows quite a bit about, having just released a book about that. Now, a former teacher, I think it's fair to say, although there is very much involved with schools still, but English teacher, head of department for years. But you are now National Content Manager at the Education Endowment Foundation. So quite an exciting role that you've got there, Alex. Alex is also, as I said, an author and quite a prolific blogger as well. So we are delighted to welcome him today. And just to clarify, this is the last session for this particular half term. Next week, we have a bit of a gap. Okay, Alex, if you are ready, over to you.
Yeah, I'm ready. Good morning, everyone. I'll just get my presentation ready. Morning. So I wanted to talk about the reading gap, and about 2 years ago when I began researching and writing this book, I didn't ever anticipate I'd be talking around school closures to the degree that we have, and I thought it would be remiss if I didn't try and have this session about this literacy challenge, about this gap that has lasted since time immemorial, but also try and hone in on some of the issues we face right now and some of the practicalities of school closures and explore some of the issues that relate to that. So I want to talk about closing the reading gap, and this was as appropriate 2 years ago. It might be more appropriate than ever, given the current circumstances children face and teachers and school leaders face. I think in my exploration of the evidence on reading, I found so many revelations, and it's quite odd if you've trained as an English teacher and you're meant to be the expert on reading, and then 15 years later, you find out so much information that you never knew when you were teaching, you certainly didn't know as a new teacher. And I think we need to do a better job of supporting and training teachers about how children learn to read and how they go on to read to learn. I think, we can be trite and say it's the job of every teacher, but it is. If you're teaching GCSE science, the ability to mediate the language of science is absolutely crucial, and it's as important that you know about reading than it is if you're a reception teacher trying to help children take those first steps. And I begin my book on reading with a quote from Frederick Douglass, who, if you know of Douglass, he was a slave who became a great statesman, and his writing on slavery was so crucial to transforming America. And one of the historical factors around reading about reading is that you recognize that it's quite a recent conception. So we've only read for 4,000 or 5,000 years, but actually it's only in the last century or so that literacy and reading has become more of a universal, experience for people. And it's less than over, 150 years ago that people in America, slaves, were having they were whipped for reading, they had their fingers chopped off. And what struck me digging into that further was that actually, if you were caught teaching another black slave to read, then you could be hung. And I think what that drove home to me is the crucial power of reading. And I think almost everybody on this webinar will be expert readers. And we can often forget the experience of novice readers, just the importance of how reading opens up the world for you as a citizen. It crowbars open imagined worlds, the past, the present and the future. It allows you to be a citizen, to read the news, to dismiss, kind of fake news and everything similar. And I think too often we can take reading for granted, and I don't think we should. And I think it should be our emphasis. And in times like this, our understanding and our focus on reading should probably be more pronounced than ever. I think I want to explore just a little about the reading gap. This is a picture of my daughter, Freya, almost 10 years ago to the day. Freya's now 11. She's about to go up to secondary school. She's a bit nervous about that. She's kind of lost all of those end of primary school rituals. But I saw this picture very recently and actually struck home to me. I love it because it's Freya reading. She's actually reading, if you're interested, a Lonely Planet book. So she's not really able to read those words, but the very act that she's able to hold a book, she's able to explore it. You can see that curious furrowed brow. She still has a furrowed brow, actually. She's weaponized that currently. But when you look at that picture, you see the importance of early reading experiences. And for me, there's lots of evidence that the reading gap and the vocabulary gap and literacy experience before children ever get to school is so crucially important. And the reference here from Jennifer Logan and colleagues around when children are not read to at home, the million-word gap, for me, that was a really salient study from last year. And it showed that before children ever get to school, that if they had that experience of reading picture books and books each day for a short time, compared to their peers who didn't have that daily reading, a child could read over 1 million more words. And it's not just about the volume, it's about the quality of those rich words that you get in books that are different from our everyday talk. And that preparedness for school, that preparedness to read is so crucial. And we know in terms of the reading gap that the reading rich get richer and the reading poor get poorer. And that this manifests itself when you get into later in primary school and you have a quarter of children, struggling to reach expected standard in reading. So I don't think we can change everything that happens outside the school gates, but I think as we face the current situation of school closures, I think we need to pay more attention than ever about how we nudge and support reading at home. And that has issues of reading access, of reading practice, of trying to nudge and support children to be more strategic as readers, which is something I want to move on to. And a couple of years ago, there was some DFE evidence that explored reading habits. And it showed that 1/3 of children don't have that daily reading at home. And for those young children, there's a preparedness, there's a gap that emerges. And if we explore what's happening now during the school closures, we can obviously see there's a correlation here between some children will just have more supports and then be more motivated and see reading as a pleasure, and others won't. So I think it's important to know where the reading gap starts, where it's established, and what we can do in the parameters for teachers in classrooms and also in the current circumstances of remote teaching. In terms of that access, I want to pose just a couple of questions, and there's a lot of people in this session, so I think the reality of doing polls, I'll steer clear. But if you just explore this question, how many disadvantaged children in the UK and in England do not own a single book at home? And just explore whether you think that's A, B, C, or D. And obviously A, there's a bit of a proxy there about how many children in our classroom don't own a book. If I pose the answer, so the answer is 1 in 8. And I think for me, some statistics can be stark and they often need more unpacking. But for me, that this is a bit of a punch on the nose in terms of a reality that lots of children just don't have the most fundamental right of owning a book. And yes, they might own a phone, they might have a laptop, but the nature of reading and the nature of reading complex texts is different. And I want to come on to that. So for me, this is a leading indicator that if children don't have access to books at home, then obviously that's going to stunt their practice. It's going to be probably an indicator that they have fewer literacy supports outside the school gates. And actually, C, 1 in 11, that indicates the general book ownership. And what we see that there's a trend here where children are reading less. And given we have school closures, that obviously matters probably more than it has previously. So what percentage of 15-year-old pupils have a reading age of 12 or under? Let me just pose that question to you from a recent study from GL Assessment. So have a think, make a note yourself. So the answer? It certainly made the news headlines very recently. It probably wasn't a shock to most teachers. We know that this manifests itself in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, where those pupils who are sitting hours and hours of GCSE exams are going to struggle to access the reading that is necessary to navigate that exams. And that can be a maths GCSE paper as much as reading Shakespeare or something we more traditionally associate with reading skill and reading knowledge. So that's quite a marked statistic, and it makes clear the gap. And actually, if we row back a few years, actually we see that in year 6, that roughly the same proportion of children don't meet expected standard in reading. Now, surely you can argue about the veracity and validity of those assessments, but when we see these marked gaps, that, you know, the trend is quite clear. And how we address those, it's obviously tricky and there are no simple solutions here, but address them we must. And for me, that the visual I reflect upon is that empty shelf, that not having a book, or more likely for so many pupils is not having a shelf at all. And I think about my own children, Freya and Noah, and the experience they've had over these past couple of months. And they read every day. We're able, around the working at home scenarios, to support them. My partner supports them brilliantly, but ultimately they have bookshelves. They have lots of access to books. And that's almost a proxy again, that they're quite motivated when they're given a reading task. They do it more strategically because they have more practice. And this absence for some children, this glaring white space when it comes to reading, is something we need to linger on and something we need to work hard to address. And I want to come back to that later on. I did mention about issues around technology, and we know that in the past decade or two, that reading is changing probably as fast as any time in those 5,000 years of reading history. And there's a really good book by Ann Woolf that shares some of the emerging evidence here around reading. And she asks some tricky questions about whether our reading skills may be deteriorating given screen reading, etc. And I think the jury is out, in truth. I don't think we know that reading is going backwards. I think reading's incredibly resilient. So there were claims from Socrates that, you know, books would hamper the human memory, and then when printed books came along, there were further critiques, and when the novel came along, there were critiques too. So we've always been quite skeptical that reading is vulnerable, but I think perhaps currently, as children read at home or don't read at all, and they're having to read a lot on the screen, we should certainly be asking these questions. And there is evidence that we can explore here that I think is instructive, and I think it's emerging, but there are some clear patterns. So this meta-analysis that's cited from 2018, it explores how, compared to reading traditional books and on paper with screen reading, that there are differences, and differences we should be aware of as teachers, and we should be conscious of as we set remote tasks and we have expectations that children are reading online. And I think the differences are interesting. It showed that there's not marked differences when reading fiction, but there seems to be more a marked comprehension skill difference when you read non-fiction, when you read informational texts. And given that's going to be a significant portion of children's diet reading at home, particularly secondary school students, actually that's something to pay close attention to. And there's something, I don't think we know the reasons why reading on screen can be less effective for many pupils. It may be something around attention, it may be something around distraction, it may be that children view reading remotely as a less serious learning activity because they read so much via their phones that they find it hard to switch modes and read more deliberately. So we don't quite know the causes of these differences, but we should be conscious that reading on screen is a different experience and it might be more challenging.
And so that's something for us to be aware of, to think about as we set remote tasks, and to also think about as children bounce back into schools. So what does that mean for right now? Well, we obviously don't have very much evidence about what the coronavirus closures is impacting on reading more specifically. You know, already very rapidly there's emerging evidence that the gap will widen between advantaged and disadvantaged pupils. I think that just kind of, you know, leads from our common sense understanding about the experiences of pupils at the moment. But I think it's worth getting underneath. There are issues of reading access. There are issues of reading practice or the lack thereof. And there's also the issue of reading on screen and how you might need to read more skillfully, more strategically, more deliberately. And I want to pose that as a focus later on in my talk. I think there are interesting questions and parallel areas of evidence around school closures that are being explored. The EF, who I work for, colleagues at the EF, including Professor Rob Coe, have been looking into the school closures gap and drawing upon evidence from summer learning loss. There is, you know, quite a lot of evidence, predominantly from the US, which has a longer summer than the English schools traditionally. And that learning loss indicates that it does have an impact on achievement. There are really interesting challenges to the summer learning loss evidence base. It's not the strongest evidence base. And some of those challenges indicate that actually summer learning loss might just be, it's an amplification of the existing literacy gaps that already occur between advantaged and disadvantaged pupils. So we don't quite know, but I think we can be pragmatic and think that months out of school will lead to children learning less, and they might be reading less effectively, reading less strategically, and how we might address these is a worthwhile consideration. And I think as we face such a legion of challenges, and I stand here kind of outside of the classroom recognizing that so many of these challenges are about logistical challenges, preparing the school, making everyone safe. Then when we do face the learning challenge, it might be that reading is an area that is a best bet for us to focus on, both as we have a potential blended approach of some remote learning and some school-based learning in the near future. One of the resources I share on my website, and I will share the PowerPoint on my website from later today too, is that I think in my book I explore different areas of the reading challenge and different barriers, and I also pose different steps we can undertake, and we can't do everything at once. And actually almost every school and every teacher is already doing reading in some sense or another. But I did want to, in the time we have, draw upon one area, and it's step 4. And step 4 is about how we may teach, model, scaffold pupils' reading so that they become strategic and knowledgeable readers. And I want to come back to that and situation of strategic and knowledgeable. I often think we can swing with a trend around education and pedagogy and curriculum. And I think a focus on knowledge and how much you need to know and the background knowledge to access reading is integral. And it's probably our first order problem. But also I think we can too easily neglect that there are reading strategies and approaches that pupils need to undertake, whether they're reading on screens, whether they're reading a traditional book, whether they're in the classroom or at home. So I want to unpick this a little, and hopefully it proves instructive and useful in that regard. Firstly, I want to get you doing some reading. So I want you to deploy your expertise, which is surely extensive around reading, but I want you to feel like a novice a little again too. And put yourself in the position of one of your pupils. And I want to introduce this German text, Brexit Boris. You'll already be kind of looking at some of the nouns there and making some judgments. It feels like a simpler time when our biggest problem was Brexit. and that's not gone away. But I do want to tackle this short passage. So my task for you, I'll give you a short amount of time, is to read this short passage and then make your best attempt at reading comprehension. What do you know? What can you piece together about this text? And as part of that activity, try and think what strategies you're actually deploying to make sense of this text. So over to you for a short amount of time. Okay, so you may have given that a go. Now, what I'm going to pose for you is the answer. Okay, so this is a build article found online, and I skillfully used Google Translate with a few edits. And it unpicks a news story which feels like a world away, but it was not too long ago actually, around the BBC and the potential dismantling of the BBC, and a German perspective on that, the legendary BBC. And what I imagine is, as you read that German, you might be drawing upon your GCSE German, you may be a German speaker, you may have, like me, very little German, next to no German, and of course that language background knowledge was integral for your ability to unpick it. But I posed it in German because I wanted you to feel like a pupil, in that when they are reading many academic texts, whether it's a reading comprehension passage in year 6 or indeed a German textbook in year 7, that pupils are often navigating unknown language and background knowledge they don't quite access. So it puts you in that position. But there was enough there for you to piece together, and it made you be strategic and metacognitive about the act of reading. You had to put your knowledge to work. You had to be strategic and knowledgeable. And what I want to do is just walk through what I think was that tacit expert process that you undertook when you read that passage. And it's so expert that it's automatic and you don't think about it. And like driving a car, you have long since forgotten about the complexities and challenges of looking in your mirror and changing gears at the same time. And I think it's useful to put ourselves back in that position of a struggling pupil who is a novice, who is reading a text in German or in physics or in year 5 on a topic they know very little about, and remember what that feels like. So here are my jigsaw pieces that walk through a stepped process. We don't read in this linear way as artfully as I present here, but the pieces of the puzzle, I think, are what we undertake as we read. So straight away, you evaluated the task. Probably before I even asked you to read and translate that passage, you already began doing it. You, I suspect, looked at the headline and you activated Brexit Boris in an instant. So you begin skimming the text. You appraise what type of passage that might be, from it being German to what type of text it might be, and you start to dig in very quickly and you start to scan the proper nouns. So I expect you looked at Brexit Boris, at BBC, at Netflix, and these were the familiar words that you were able to very quickly start to artfully connect together. And if you have German knowledge, you probably had a lot more background knowledge to access, and it was a much easier job. So you start to activate your prior knowledge. So you see Brexit Boris, you see BBC, and you start to make connections that is dependent on your knowledge of the world. And then you probably did some rereading. So you quickly scanned and you got a sense of the text, you quickly appraised those key nouns, and then you started to go back and started to be more deliberate and analysing sentence by sentence. You started to link those nouns and ask further questions. You started to make more detailed predictions about what this text was about. And then you started to build schema. You started to piece together the mental model of this text, or you started to visualize this text. And I think schema is a term now that we're getting much more familiar with. It's a term that Ofsted are using more commonly, and a lot of I'm seeing it appearing in much more writing for teachers. So this schema building is part of our curriculum building. It's part of our everyday teaching. It's just the language about building and connecting prior knowledge, and what we know leads to learning new knowledge. So we undertake that. And then when we started to build a sense of the text, we start to fill in the gaps. We start to take those pieces that we couldn't quite fit. So we might explore unfamiliar word parts, or indeed unfamiliar words and phrases. We might start to try and evaluate and glean some more meaning from punctuation and sentence structures and syntax. We might start to clarify our understanding. We might start to ask further questions and probe what we know and what we don't know. And then finally, we likely summarize. And I think summarizing is often a kind of a real master skill in the reading process, because it doesn't just, you know, piece together that knowledge and starts to build new knowledge. It also helps us elaborate and create a richer schema or mental model of a text, which makes it more memorable. So you have here this nice, neat picture. You have all the pieces of the puzzle. And if you're like me, your jigsaw puzzles might have become more part of your daily life at the moment, which again is another unexpected factor. But I think the reality of this puzzle is that for so many of our pupils, it's a bit of a jumble. And it's not a linear, clean process. Not every pupil sees the full picture. In fact, most pupils don't. And if I return back to those 15-year-olds, that quarter of children who've got a reading age far below the chronological age, or that quarter of children who don't meet the expected standard in Key Stage 2, or those children who don't match the phonics check early on, they have this jumble and they have crucial missing pieces. And I think that's where we need to attend so much of our focus at the moment. And I think there are strategies that help us think about how we read and reread and how we read more strategically. So one approach, which I've labeled just this gaze approach, actually is just a way of making visible and making deliberate the act of rereading a text, and how we skim and scan initially, then how we analyze more carefully. So it might be a geography case study in year 11, it might be a science experiment description in year 5, but we need to read with, you know, deliberate attention, and we need to get the gist, but we need to go beyond getting the gist. We need to have a fuller mental model, a fuller, richer schema, the full picture. Otherwise, what we read is not remembered. And I think if I worry a little about what's happening with a lot of home reading, I think for your average to weaker readers, they will read a text, but they will be less strategic and they will probably forget elements. And I don't pose these strategies as anything new. My research for the book explored reading throughout history. And when you explore how medieval scholars would read, they would very deliberately have multiple readings of the text. They would first read for the grammar, then they would read for meaning, and they would read for a synthesis of what other commentators thought about such books, before they then elaborate and talk about what they've read. So rereading, deliberate strategic reading, is as old as reading itself. It's just that we can often take it for granted, and we should surface it and be deliberate and explicit about teaching children exactly how to read, and in different domains. How you read a word problem in mathematics, rereading and extracting the mathematical operations from the vocabulary in mathematics is really key. Whereas if you read in history, you are often corroborating sources. So that's a very different type of reading. And then when you read a poem, you're reading for meaning and you're trying to elaborate on multiple meanings, which in many ways is quite the opposite approach and strategy for a mathematician. So also deliberating on how reading might look differently in different domains is also very useful knowledge understanding for every teacher. And I want to linger a little on the evidence around readers who don't read so strategically, who lack background knowledge, and also lack this ability to actively construct that mental model of a text. And the term poor comprehenders is what a lot of the expert researchers have labeled it. So Kate Kane and Jane Oakhill are huge experts in reading comprehension. And this notion that so many pupils don't actively construct meaning, they don't ask the seemingly simple questions we expect, I think that's really important knowledge. And it might be that they're reading a science textbook in year 9 and they've got a chapter and you might think it's very artfully constructed and you've got headings and you've got emboldened text and graphics and a glossary. And yet so much of our understanding of weaker readers is that they don't ask the seemingly obvious questions. They don't undertake seemingly obvious, strategies like summarizing. And so we need to make what is implicit to those readers explicit and make it deliberate and teach with that in mind. So if I was to summarize, and I want to come back to knowledge in a moment, there's something here about knowledge, background knowledge being paramount and being crucial. Without that knowledge, you cannot piece together a text. If you don't know about Brexit Boris and you don't know about the BBC or Netflix and you don't speak German, then you cannot strategically piece together a text. And yet, this is not an either-or scenario. You need to be strategic to learn new knowledge. Most of the texts that pupils are faced with in school, they don't have complete knowledge of that text. They only ever have a partial understanding. So we have to help them be strategic. And that's what makes a skilled reader. And I want to spend a little bit of time now on knowledge and what makes a text difficult. And background knowledge is one factor, but there are other factors too. And every year, I think we might have been spared this year, but every year these headlines about, Mr. Men being more challenging than John Steinbeck and Roald Dahl and all these other rather silly headlines that are drawn out of analysis of reading difficulty that is based on sentence length, on vocabulary length, etc. Now, we know that vocabulary complexity matters. We know that sentence length matters. So a nice simple proxy for me is that if a sentence has 3 clauses, then that's going to be tricky for most students. And then if it has a lot of subject-specific language or sophisticated vocabulary, it's going to be hard to read. I think that makes obvious sense. But then there are other layers of complexity that mean that the reading challenge is difficult. So if you take John Steinbeck, an English GCSE, a former English GCSE text, then there are complexities around meaning, around mature themes of human nature, and also around metaphors and symbolism that wouldn't be captured in an analysis of sentence length. So we need to better understand what makes reading complex. The way that I've tried to pose this is with the moniker the Arduous 8. And it's a resource I share on my website, so you can download it if you want to know a bit more, and I've written a blog about it. But I think it's worth breaking down the different aspects of reading complexity. Background knowledge being number 1 here, vocabulary being number 2, but also trying to see the full gamut, and from sentence length to text length, all of these factors interact to make a text difficult. And I think it's important that whether you're teaching science, whether you're teaching a topic in year 4, or whether you're selecting reading for drop everything and read or encouraging reading at home, you've got a strong awareness of reading complexity. And one of the ideas I pose is that we should try and apply a Goldilocks principle, that for every child who's reading, that what they're reading is not too easy, not too hard, but just right. And I've been thinking about my own children during lockdown and their reading. And I want to give some exemplification later on where that's been even more marked for me. That if we don't carefully calibrate what children are reading at home, then they will struggle and they won't remember and they won't be able to access our curriculum as much as they'd still struggle to do that in the classroom. Firstly, I just want to present some challenging texts, but also this notion that I've taken from Doug Lemov and his excellent book, Reading Reconsidered, around pre-complex texts. And I think this is relevant for coronavirus closures that we face now, that we might have to try and identify and support those pre-complex texts that help build knowledge of the world, help build those mental models of say, Dickens, but do it in a way that's accessible, that meets that Goldilocks principle. So this is a book, The Illustrated Stories from Dickens, that I read with my little boy Noah, who's 8, turning 9 in a couple of weeks. And we read this a few months ago, and it really struck me reading this book, how it was accessible, because the sentence length, the story length was mediated very carefully, and yet it was still challenging. And one of the things that struck me as when we read this text together before bedtime were the number of questions about the Victorian era that it prompted and that Noah was asking. So questions about child mortality, not in those words, questions about poverty, questions about society and history. And what was really great, it added a rich knowledge of the world in a way that was still accessible, and it wasn't going too hard too early. And I think here there's a message for our curriculum, and a message for both our curriculum within the classroom and our curriculum outside the school gates. And if I was to also focus again on it, I'm conscious on using English text in the first instance, because that's an area I'm most familiar with. I think in secondary schools, we can often see a solution that if we just read the text earlier and read it again, maybe, that will mediate the complexity. And I think that's a suboptimal approach, and that we should try and leave Romeo and Juliet for an apt approach and read it as late as possible, but try and support our novice readers to read pre-complex texts. So Rani and Suk by Bali is a contemporary story that effectively takes the narrative architecture of Romeo and Juliet and presents it in the present day. It offers really complex themes and interesting, debates. It brings new challenges around culture and race that I think are really valuable for children in our classrooms, but also is a Goldilocks text in its accessibility, and it readies children to read Romeo and Juliet later on. So I think here we're thinking about curriculum building, we're thinking about text selection, we're thinking about what children read in the classroom and outside the school gates. And one reflection recently, my children have been doing a lot of reading around subjects, and I've been trying to support with that. And one of the things they've not been reading, but I'm conscious of, is BBC History Magazine offers really interesting articles on history that offer themselves pre-complex texts that ready children for that diet of reading like a historian in secondary school. And I think this thinking around the what Christine Council calls the hinterland of subject domains is a really useful concept, and trying to read more broadly and reading multiple texts about a period in history, multiple texts about a concept in science, can actually deepen understanding and help children build that schema that we talked about earlier. And it offers more concise, broken down texts, but many times it might actually offer more elaborate texts that we can read around the margins of the curriculum. And this is something that teachers are conscious of, and we're also conscious that the curriculum is full to bursting, but how do we ensure that children are sustaining reading that is rich, that is building their knowledge and reading skill? These are questions that every teacher needs to be posing. In terms of science, so my daughter Freya, she's in year 6, and she's very interested in science at the moment. So we've bought books around women in science, which she's found fascinating and have really propelled her motivation and interest. And I was keenly interested in this book on the periodic table, and how it was quite a typical informational text, quite complex, lots going on, but lots of scaffolds as well. But what I recognized reading this with my daughter was it certainly built that broader background knowledge that will help her preparedness for secondary school when she begins in September. But also it was still a significant challenge. And I had to try and navigate and support her reading this, and my partner also. So this is about understanding what makes a text complex to read. It's understanding our pupils and what barriers they might have. And also it's about carefully constructing a curriculum that develops a connected, complex, rich diet of reading And that's something that is about building a curriculum and building a culture that emphasizes reading. And if I come back to the Arduous 8, we can start to apply it. So you can see how different factors in the Arduous 8 are all interacting in one go when it comes to a singular text. But knowing that and being deliberate about scaffolds and how you might navigate those texts, being deliberate about what background knowledge might be missing, this is the, the essential nuanced knowledge that teachers need to have. And I want to just pose one example of reading background knowledge and Goldilocks text during school closures. So my children were both reading about the French Revolution only last week, and I tried to find some good reading for them that was just right. It was some Goldilocks reading. And on the left-hand side, you see that Duxter's text, and it could have been, Britannica, it could have been the BBC, but it was well calibrated reading material, full of rich, complex, terminology, but mediated in a way that was accessible. And because of various reasons that my partner wasn't supervising at that moment, and neither was I, my little boy went onto Wikipedia to find out a little bit more about Robespierre. He still can't pronounce Robespierre, by the way. That's a bone of contention in our house. But when he explored Wikipedia, he couldn't make head nor tail. And actually, he ended up writing down some notes that he knew very little about. And it really brought home to me how background knowledge is crucial, but also how reading selection and mediating reading was really key too. And the difference between Duxter's and Wikipedia was really pronounced. And if I just take that reign of terror, obviously there's just a wealth of powerful knowledge here that every time a child reads, they need to draw upon, they need to activate, they need to use. And just unpicking that one word, reign, and homonyms we know can be tricky for many pupils. If you just explore some of the underlying worldly knowledge around that singular term, you start to see the complexity of reading. And this is where the vocabulary gap and the reading gap are inextricably linked, and that we can address them together. And I think if I pose just a nice pithy quotation to summarize the importance of knowledge there, and to exemplify Duxter's and the reign of terror, it's this E.D. Hirsch quotation. And if I return to what I think is this important kind of calculation, if you like, that it is about knowledge and strategy, that is what makes skilled readers. And we need to attend to both concurrently. So if children are reading at home, are we supporting them to be strategic in how they make notes, in how they make predictions, in how they summarize? How are we helping children to remember what they've read? So my children are often undertaking writing activities to try and consolidate and elaborate on what they've understood when they've read. And that's really crucial, that we pick the right writing activities. A poster every time probably won't do the job if we've got some complex reading. And if I just pose a question really rather than an answer here, I think it makes us ask questions about our curriculum. And I've used this analogy that we can spend a lot of time artfully creating a beautiful curriculum. It can be a real Ferrari curriculum. But if we're not deliberately focusing on reading access, reading practice, reading strategy, then actually it's like having a Ferrari, but not having the key. And that might be, frustrating. And we often talk about reading for pleasure and reading motivation. I know that's a question I get asked a lot by teachers and parents. But fundamentally, our first order question here is, how do we help children to be more skilled readers? Because that will foster the motivation and the pleasure that then creates this reading richness and the reading rich getting richer. So there are questions about curriculum that are still live for us now, and that become different and pronounced because of school closures, but no less pertinent. And I don't think I can address a whole school reading culture with appropriateness and with the depth that it deserves in the talk time that we have now. But I think this is about every teacher having apt training. So that might be maths teachers and science teachers in secondary school as much as any other teacher. And in primary school, there's learning to read every teacher needs to understand the role of structured phonics and fluency and vocabulary and reading comprehension strategies, as well as reading to learn, and how you connect up those reading texts, and how you build your knowledge and understanding and get better at accessing reading comprehension assessments and fundamentally accessing the school curriculum. In terms of reading culture, I think we can too often be superficial in this regard, because we're all so busy and we're all doing reading in various ways. And I think the likes of milestones like World Book Day can be positive in signaling reading matters, or drop everything and read can be positive in that we're allocating time to reading in our school day. But I think the problem is more nuanced and challenging, and that one-offs won't make a difference, and that we need to ensure that reading events and drop everything and read are really strategically implemented. And that might mean that reading selection and reading access, particularly for those quarter of children who struggle most, I think reading access and supported book choices and supported reading strategically will matter, as much as we need to be thinking about every text we choose in the classroom and how we approach reading outside the classroom. And just one strategy here that I think is pertinent to the reading gap and pertinent to the current issues we face with school closures, is that we can often think that book gifting would be an answer. So we've got that empty bookshelf, and that's the issue that is so salient to us, that so many children just don't even own books, and how can they ever become school readers without that ownership? What I want to pose here is problematize that a little, in that book gifting is probably a very positive notion, but in and of itself, it's unlikely to be successful unless we think of how well it's implemented and the structured support that is wrapped around it. Because ultimately, lots of struggling readers don't really have the ability to read a book, even if it's gifted to them, even if it's a rather well-chosen selection. They still need supports in the home. Parents still need supportive nudges. So they become quite complex implementation challenges. But if we're looking at reading access and reading practice, they are good things to focus on in the moment we face now and when we return back to school. But book gifting isn't an easy solution either. So we come here to, there are lots of different priorities. And they all interact with one another. So there is no kind of definitive start here, everybody response that I can pose. This is about reflecting on what we're already doing, reflecting and auditing our reading culture, our teacher knowledge, our pupils and how well they're attaining and accessing the reading materials of school. But we probably need to make some choices around prioritization. So this is a resource that again is on the website. You can draw, and this could be, part of a conversation with colleagues at school. But we need to put things in some sort of sequence, because we can't do everything well at once. And just to reiterate, I think given our current constraints, we simply can't do everything. So reading assessment, small group reading, and lots of things that we would typically do if we were unfettered by school closures. We have to be pragmatic. So there's new priorities that might emerge. And this isn't something that any singular teacher can do. I think there are school level, departmental level, phase level conversations and supports that need to happen here. I think happily, because reading and the issues around reading are well known, I think there are lots of resources. So at the top there, I've got a lot of free resources that you can download, some of which I've highlighted in this session, vocabulary resources too. There are some fantastic websites that have got really well underpinned by evidence. So I think Reading Rockets is an excellent website. It's American. It covers all aspects of literacy, not just reading. But I keep on going back to that again and again and sharing that with colleagues. So I recommend that. There are experts. So we've already heard from experts like Diane Murphy and Dan Willingham, who are kind of experts in reading. I mentioned Doug Lemov earlier. And you've got the likes of Professor Tim Shanahan, who's expert. I mentioned again, Professor Kate Kane and others. There is a wealth, a real group of experts that every teacher should know something about. And in my reading list that I pose in the resources for closing the reading gap, lots of those are referenced, and there's quite a lot of free online resources, so please do dig into that. And also there are interventions, and in the time that we have now, it might be worth reflecting on what might be appropriate catch-up interventions for some pupils. I just mentioned Nellie here, which is an early language intervention, which is about oral language, but it's about that preparedness for school. And if you remember all the way back to the start of the presentation where I showed you that picture of Freya and the important foundations that need to be in place for reading, there are interventions that at each stage for pupils that are evidence-based, that are best bets. And then lastly, I work for the EF, and I've played a part in writing some guidance reports, including the secondary literacy guidance report. Here is the Preparing for Literacy guidance. I think there's a lot of gems in there. We're currently updating the Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 literacy guidance reports. So we hopefully there's some useful resources, additional and new for September particularly. And then we've produced some COVID resources that we think are helpful too around reading and having conversations around reading. And I think actually trying to shrink this problem for parents and not trying to worry parents so much. That small acts of reading daily, talking about what's been read, can have a big impact, and they can really accumulate, and as the evidence indicates. And if you follow me on Twitter already, you'll know I spend far too much time on Twitter, but hopefully I also share some useful sources and resources and try and amplify a lot of the expertise in this area. And I'm sure in the coming months, given our unique situation, there'll be more evidence and more interesting insights into reading that we can hook into too. So do give me a follow, and do ask me a question if that's helpful. And it'd be remiss if I didn't plug my book and say that might help too. Thank you.
Sorry, we've got far too many questions to be able to answer in the time available, but there are a few people asking about tips to help students develop Tier 2 language. So can I just say that you've also got resources for that on your website, and a whole book dedicated to closing the vocabulary gap, I think. So we're not going to address that perhaps this morning. Okay, so how do we get parents involved in a deprived area? And that's the language used by the person asking.
Yeah, so this is a conversation that I've had with lots of school leaders at the moment. There's obviously a lot of criticisms firing left and right about schools and technology and access. I think we need to be pragmatic and understand our school context. So I'm only going to make generalizations here, but some of the evidence indicates that the likes of text messaging is probably more effective than other modes of electronic communication than say emails. So regular, accessible text messaging could be a way to help. I think I discussed here around a lot of children just not having access to books. There is something around the delivery and the sharing of real books and real text. And I know a lot of schools have shared packs and shared, concrete resources. So there's not a reliance on technology and Wi-Fi and all those other barriers for a lot of families. So there's something around direct sharing. There's something around simple, regular, accessible communications. There's something around book talk. I think for me, I think we shouldn't overwhelm parents and make them worry about, every child has to do this immense, massive reading. A lot of children aren't motivated to read, and it takes a teacher's skill to help them access it. But I think building a daily reading habit, so it might be in the morning when they're a bit fresh, it might be just nice relaxed read before bedtime. So if I take my daughter, she's 11, she's a competent reader, but she would rather draw for an hour than pick up a book. And so we try and find other habits rather than create a fight around it. And for me, that habit is bedtime, and we've got a good routine. So I think it's about trying to find routines, trying to support parents just with simple, accessible strategies. And there is no silver bullet here. And if we could give laptops, and it's a bit of a naive understanding about the many barriers that families face in deprived areas. And I think in truth, a lot of schools are doing this really well. So there's some evidence about what we should do. And I think it probably amplifies what schools are already doing in many cases.
Thank you. Question from a secondary teacher. Is there a list of examples of age-related books that give good illustration of what children at different reading ages can access? So that's from someone who finds it hard to imagine what reading age 8, for example, means, as they have no child of that age themselves.
Yeah, so in the book I share some links around. There are websites that give more age-specific kind of reading choices, often fiction. Websites I like, so the Royal Society has an annual book competition of books that are written with a science basis for younger people. And if you go on the Royal Society website, I can't remember the book awards exactly, but just put science book Royal Academy, and there's a ample back catalogue of books that were recommended for those awards, and that's the best list of science books that I've seen. I used it myself as a parent. I think it's a great curriculum building exercise as well. There are websites like Love Reading for Kids that give a more calibrated age-related focus, and actually I am in truth a little bit wary of posing an easy answer here, because often it's the act of a school and a set of teachers looking at what they have in their curriculum and trying to build around that. That's most meaningful. So I gave the example earlier on of the BBC magazine, but in the book I talk about a history subject leader in secondary school, Tim Jennings, who has developed their own history book and magazine and article library, and they share that directly with their children. And I think that type of approach is probably optimum, because it's building wider reading that's well calibrated to the curriculum. And so I think that's probably the best solution. I do recognize that sometimes departments need a bit of a support to get started with that, and websites like Royal Society are really good. The research from Teresa Kremin, if you Google Open University and Teresa Kremin, there's a huge amount of good quality advice for primary school teachers, particularly around building reading communities and understanding what children should read and what they could read. And I find on Twitter, I'm constantly seeking out recommendations. In the book, I use the case study of St. Matthew's, which is a fantastic primary school in Birmingham, and I follow Sonia online, and people like Sonia and lots of other head teachers and literacy teachers are sharing resources and ideas all the time. So many a time I've posed the question, what can I get my 11-year-old daughter reading in terms of science, and I get some great feedback. But there are other sources as well.
Thank you. In your book, you talk a lot about experiences and the struggle of inference for those who have poor cultural capital, and this is in speech marks.
Yeah.
How do you think schools can combat this in the classroom?
So I think there are, for the last 2 or 3 years, we've had these significant debates around powerful knowledge and cultural capital, and everyone having probably slightly different notions about what those things are. I think for me, at both primary and secondary school, this is about curriculum building. This is about making sure that every book choice, every task choice or topic choice is carefully connected up, and that we can't create this kind of easy ladder where you read one thing and then the next thing falls into place. But when I showed those pre-complex texts earlier on, I think subject teachers in secondary school know what topics are most salient, where the tricky, hard areas are, where pupils lack most background knowledge. So it's trying to be artful about your curriculum sequencing and trying to think about reading opportunities around that curriculum. And I think in primary school, just after this session, I know the REACH, John Hutchinson, and who's spoken on researchED, and other colleagues from the REACH school are talking about how they've approached the history curriculum in primary school, the geography curriculum. And when you look at it, it's about really well calibrated, well sequenced decisions around topics and texts. So there is we can't take every child the zoo, we can't take every child the cinema or the theatre or go on holidays. But what we can do, we have a huge capacity in terms of the curriculum experiences we offer and the richness of reading we can support. We can, and thinking around what happens outside the classroom and just trying to build that up cumulatively. I think we can make a difference in terms of the knowledge and the cultural capital, you know, for what that term might be.
Yeah, you've certainly made the case for really carefully building the curriculum and all the reading around it. And someone was commenting on the fact that libraries should really be supported. It should be a supportive system, a two-way system in schools. Are audiobooks valuable in supporting students' reading progress, or do the benefits come from actually following the words in a physical text?
Okay, so this is a tricky one. So the evidence is, I don't think, categorical about this. So a little bit like reading on screen is different to reading on the page, and listening to a book is different. So it can depend. Ultimately, it can depend on how much attention you're allotting to that listening. So I've got to listening to audiobooks, and on my weekly shop, I listen to an audiobook each week, but I'm not allocating all my attention to that listening. And actually, I can only read certain books. So I read lighter books and I read books about football. I don't read academic texts because I can't allot the attention to that listening. And actually, individually, my comprehension is stronger when I've got visible access to the text, to the kind of all the supports and the graphics, etc. So I think probably in many cases, reading on paper would be optimal and more effective in terms of comprehension than reading on the screen. In terms of audio, I think we know a bit less. What I would say in defense of audiobooks is actually for a lot of children, there's a motivation factor for audiobooks. They're able to switch off a little, they're able to concentrate in a way that feels comfortable for them. So what I would say is in some cases, you know, audiobooks might enhance motivation, which goes on to enhance practice, which improves reading comprehension. So not an easy one here. I'd probably, you know, I've got a preference in terms of, you know, reading, good old fashioned reading, probably still optimum. It was optimum 100 years ago. It was optimum a week ago. It still is. But audiobooks, I think, should be in our armory, and we should think about how we use them well.
Different purposes. It's past noon, but can I just perhaps ask a last one? Yeah, could you make a comment on the significance of teachers reading out loud to students?
Okay, so I think you just made the point about actually how we read and decisions we make about reading should be linked to the goals and what we're looking to learn. So if you're reading aloud to a group of children, that has obvious benefits. So benefits might include that a child gets to hear what a fluent reader sounds like, and the emphasis you put on certain words, and the stress and the kind of prosody, the music that you evoke around what's being read, and that can aid comprehension. I think it's a bit debatable whether the split attention of reading along hampers, and whether how exactly you should do it. I know some people think that reading aloud should be a singular activity and you shouldn't try and follow at the same time. I think the evidence isn't clear. It's not categorical. I think for me, reading aloud is good for hearing a fluent reader. It's often good for comprehension. The type of round robin reading where you ask a pupil to read can have benefits. So you can have a benefit in terms of a child building their own fluency, but then they might then have to, you know, kind of overcompensate and focus on fluency, and then they lose their ability to remember and comprehend. So it's a horses for courses type of answer. It depends what you're looking to develop in terms of the reading skill. I don't think the evidence is categorical. The one resource I share freely on the resource page is different whole class reading approaches. And rather than saying, do this, don't do this, I pose, here's the approach, lots of which will be familiar. Here are the pros, here are the cons, and make your decision based on what you're looking for.
Thank you. And perhaps a last word of advice to librarians. Someone's asking, is there anything that libraries can do at this point in time to help close the reading gap during lockdown?
So in my book, I talk about library use, and I think a school library is often the canary in the coal mine, kind of represents your reading culture. But you can have a well-stocked library and it's not well used. I think during this time now, I think what we know, Teresa Kremen's research indicates that a lot of teachers don't have a great knowledge of children's literature. They don't have a wide repertoire of understanding themselves, whereas the librarian often does. So one strategy might be the librarian offering some training for staff around what reading materials might be useful, some reading strategies, and some reading choices. So that question, which I get every time I talk about reading from the colleague earlier around, you know, is there a kind of a reading list, if you like? I think that's where your librarian really shows their skill and knowledge. And but I think what's really key here is that a librarian is only as good as how they're supported to be good, and supported by school leadership and prioritized by school leadership. So I think this isn't a job for one person. Teachers need support here. It's really tricky. They've got gaps in their knowledge. The librarian can help, but they need support. And like most complex problems in schools, it will be mediated and supported by school leaders. So my final word would be a plea for school leaders to prioritize reading during this time. I know, you know, my sister's a primary head teacher. She's absolutely swamped at the minute with all kinds of issues around logistics and children, year 2 children licking other children and being completely unaware that that's a problem at the minute. There are lots of challenges for school leaders, but if we were to shrink some of our challenges down in terms of the school closure problem, the gap, reading's a good start. Reading's always a good focus. So that would be my final appeal.
Thank you. You've been extremely generous with your time. I'm sorry we went over. Actually, someone just sent do you know when we talked about the audiobooks? Someone says, how about reading the physical text alongside listening to the audiobook?
Yeah, I think ultimately the evidence, and this is a good kind of meta point about research evidence, the evidence often doesn't give us a clear, definitive answer. This is about making informed choices. And I think for some children, they will have comprehension benefits from different modes of reading. And I think there's a bit of test and learn that we should try and practice and see how different strategies work. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of personalized kind of catching up with pupils at the minute, catching up about what they're reading is a good question, but also just giving them 1 or 2 little new approaches that might just boost their motivation. So yeah, again, it's kind of, there's lots of opportunities to seize, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. I know I have to let you go, and I have a lesson in a few minutes.
Yeah,
thank you very much for your time. Have a great day, Alex. And we will share the PowerPoint later, the presentation later.
Fab.
If you make it available.
Yeah, will do.
Okay.
Thank
All right.
You. Bye.
Bye. Right, everyone. Next week is half term, so we're taking a break. We'll be back on 1st of June, I believe. First week back after half term. I've lost sight of the dates. It will be with Claire Seeley. We might not do something live, but we're trying to work around that. But certainly we will continue with daily sessions for a while yet. Okay, have a great break. Bye-bye.